Here's a number that should stop you cold. In a single year, Apple's services business, things like the App Store, iCloud, and Apple Music, pulled in over $96 billion in revenue at a profit margin north of 70%. 70%. For comparison, most good businesses would celebrate half that. But here's the strange part. For decades, Apple was famous for selling gadgets, physical things made of glass and metal. So how did a hardware company quietly build one of the most profitable machines in corporate history? And why is the real secret hiding not in the iPhone itself, but in what happens after you buy it? Stick with me, because by the end, you'll see the invisible trap that keeps 2.2 billion devices and their owners locked in. Let me set the scene. Apple is not just profitable, it is profitable at a scale that bends the imagination. In fiscal year 2024, its active installed base of devices crossed 2.2 billion worldwide. Think about that. That is more than a quarter of every human being on the planet holding an Apple product in their pocket, on their wrist, or in their bag. Now, most companies would look at that number and see customers. Apple looks at it and sees a captive audience, a standing army of consumers ready to be sold to, again and again, long after the first purchase. Our animated guide today, Champa, likes to describe it this way. Selling you an iPhone is not the finish line, it is the starting gun. Because the moment that device is in your hand, Apple begins the real game, the one that generates those extraordinary margins. And that game rests on 4 pillars: pricing psychology, ecosystem lock-in, supply chain mastery, and the quiet pivot to services. Let's take them one at a time. Start with pricing, because it is more clever than it looks. When Apple launches an iPhone, it doesn't offer just one. In 2024, the iPhone 16 arrived in a careful ladder. The standard model, a larger Plus, then the Pro Max, with flagship prices climbing from around $999 to nearly $1,200. Marketers call this good, better, best, and it is a masterstroke of human psychology. Here's why. If Apple only sold a $1,000 phone, many shoppers would balk. But present 3 or 4 tiers, and something magical happens in the buyer's mind. Suddenly, the middle option feels reasonable, and the customer who could stretch to the Pro Max feels rewarded for spending more. Every shopper self-sorts into exactly the price they're willing to pay. Economists call that capturing consumer surplus, squeezing out the maximum each person is quietly prepared to hand over. And notice, there's always an aspirational model gleaming at the top, so even the buyer of the cheapest phone feels they've bought into something premium. Apple never competes on being the cheapest, it competes on being the most desired. That is a very different and far more lucrative race to run. Now for the pillar that truly explains the empire, ecosystem lock-in. Picture our stick figure, D, standing there. D buys an iPhone, simple enough. But then D notices how nice it would be to have AirPods that pair instantly. Then a Mac, so files just appear across devices through iCloud. Then an Apple Watch. Then an iPad. Each new purchase feels like a convenience, but watch what's really happening. Features like AirDrop, Handoff, iMessage, and seamless iCloud sync only work flawlessly inside Apple's world. The more Apple products D owns, the more painful it becomes to leave. Harvard Business Review studied exactly this, and the finding is striking. An iPhone owner who also has a Mac, an iPad, AirPods, or a watch is dramatically less likely to ever switch to Android. Why? Because switching no longer means replacing one phone, it means dismantling an entire connected life. Losing the blue bubbles, the automatic photo sync, the effortless handoff between screens. Champa calls it the golden cage. The bars are made of convenience, so it never feels like a prison. But the economics are ruthless. Every additional device tightens the lock, and a locked-in customer is a customer who keeps buying, and crucially, keeps subscribing. Which brings us to where the real money hides. Before we get to the money, we need to understand how Apple keeps costs so astonishingly low. Because you cannot have world-class margins without world-class discipline on the other side of the ledger. And here Apple pulls off a beautiful trick. It dominates its supply chain without owning most of it. Apple doesn't run the sprawling factories that assemble iPhones. That work goes to partners like Foxconn and Pegatron, who employ hundreds of thousands of workers across enormous plants. The delicate, cutting-edge chips inside your phone, those are fabricated by TSMC in Taiwan, arguably the most advanced manufacturer on Earth. Bloomberg has described Apple's supply chain as a model of dominance precisely because it keeps Apple's own capital expenditure lean. Apple designs the product, controls the specifications, and then negotiates from a position of overwhelming power. Because it buys in such colossal volume that suppliers reorganize their entire operations around Apple's orders. So Apple gets the benefits of manufacturing scale without the burden of building and maintaining the factories. It books the high margins, the partners absorb the heavy fixed costs and thin returns. It is, in a sense, owning everything by owning nothing. That lean structure is the foundation on which the final, most profitable pillar is built. Here is the resolution to the mystery I opened with. Remember that 70% margin business? That is services, and it is the real engine of Apple's profit story today. In fiscal 2024, services generated $96.2 billion in revenue, up from roughly $68 billion just 3 years earlier. That is explosive growth for a company already this large. And the margins tell the deeper truth. Apple's physical products carry a gross margin of around 37%, impressive for hardware. But services runs at roughly 70 to 74%. Let that sink in. For every dollar of services revenue, a far larger share flows straight to the bottom line. Now connect the dots. Why can Apple sell services so profitably? Because of that installed base of 2.2 billion devices, the captive audience, because of the golden cage that keeps them loyal. Every time someone buys an app, pays for extra iCloud storage, streams on Apple Music, subscribes to Apple TV Plus, or taps Apple Pay, Apple collects high-margin revenue with almost no additional manufacturing cost. This is the flywheel. Hardware attracts users. The ecosystem locks them in. Services extract steady, recurring, high-profit revenue from that locked-in base. And those profits fund the next generation of hardware, which pulls in even more users. Round and round it spins, each turn wealthier than the last. That is how a company once defined by shiny objects became a machine that increasingly profits from software, subscriptions, and services you barely notice paying for. So there it is, 4 pillars, one extraordinary machine. Premium pricing that captures the most each buyer will pay. An ecosystem so convenient it becomes a cage. A supply chain that delivers scale without the burden of ownership. And a services empire quietly harvesting profit from over 2 billion devices. Together they explain how Apple built and sustains one of the richest business models in corporate history. But every empire eventually faces its stress test. Regulators around the world are now scrutinizing the App Store's fees and Apple's grip on its ecosystem. Competitors are chipping away, and the very lock-in that made Apple powerful is drawing legal attention. So the real question, the one worth sitting with, is this. Can a business model built on keeping customers inside a golden cage survive in a world that increasingly demands the doors be opened? Whatever the answer, understanding how this machine works tells you almost everything about how modern profit is truly made.